Let me tell you about the things I was certain of. I was certain that I was a city person. I had been born in Chicago, raised in Chicago, educated in Chicago, and had spent 27 years building the specific identity of someone who belonged to a city. The noise, the density, the particular freedom of being nobody in a crowd of millions. I was certain that whatever came next in my life would happen in a city, ideally Chicago, possibly New York or San Francisco if the right opportunity presented itself. I was certain that I had a very clear picture of the kind of person I was going to fall in love with, the kind of person who existed in cities, who had opinions about coffee and architecture and the latest thing happening in culture, who would meet me at the specific intersection of intellectual and social that my life in Chicago had trained me to inhabit. I was certain, in short, about a lot of things. And then my company transferred me to Marfa, Texas. Not Austin, not Dallas, not Houston. Marfa. Population approximately 1,800. Located in the far west of Texas, approximately 60 miles north of the Mexican border in the high Chihuahuan Desert, where the horizon goes on forever and the nearest city of meaningful size is 3 hours away. Marfa, Texas, famous for mysterious lights that appear on the desert at night, famous for its unexpected contemporary art scene, famous for being in the specific way of places that exist far from the centers of things exactly itself and nothing else. I arrived on a Sunday in September. I met Cole Bennett on the Monday. And I was wrong about everything I had been certain of. My name is Julian Rivera. This is the story of how a cowboy from the Chihuahuan Desert made me a person who understood what it meant to be exactly where I was supposed to be. The company was an environmental consulting firm. I had been with them for 4 years, having joined straight out of a master's program in environmental science from the University of Chicago. My specialty was air quality assessment and impact analysis. My work was primarily regulatory, reviewing industrial permits, assessing compliance, writing reports that went to government agencies, and that contained the specific technical language of a field that mattered, but that most people never saw. The Marfa transfer was for a 2-year assignment. The Permian Basin, the massive oil and gas-producing region of West Texas, had created a significant need for air quality monitoring in the surrounding area. The company had won a contract with a regional coalition of environmental advocacy organizations to conduct baseline assessments of air quality in communities near the basin's expansion. The nearest monitoring hub to the relevant geography was Marfa. My supervisor had told me, "Julian, you are the best we have for this kind of long-duration field assessment, and you are the only one without commitments that would make a 2-year relocation impossible." What he meant by commitments was children or a spouse or a mortgage. What he meant by impossible was that everyone with those things had said no. I had said yes because I was 27 and unattached, and because the work was genuinely important, and because a small part of me that I had not examined carefully had decided that my Chicago life, while excellent in most measurable ways, had become very small in the specific way that efficient lives become small. I had said yes. And I had driven into Marfa on a Sunday in September, and I had stood in front of the rental house on Lincoln Street, and I had looked at the sky. The sky in Marfa was not the same sky I had been living under in Chicago. It was enormous. Not in a romantic description way, actually enormous. The absence of tall buildings and the elevation Marfa sits at about 4,700 feet above sea level, and the specific quality of high desert air produced a sky that was a different category of sky from anything I had experienced. I stood in front of the rental house and I looked up and I thought, okay, different. And I went inside. And on Monday morning I drove to the environmental monitoring station the company had established at the edge of town, 3 miles from the center, where the desert began in earnest. And Cole Bennett was there. He was 32 years old. He had been hired by the coalition as the local liaison, the person who knew the land, the ranches, the families, the geography, the specific complicated politics of a rural community that was simultaneously dependent on the extractive industry the assessment was studying and concerned about its environmental effects. He was from Marfa, 3rd generation. His grandfather had ranched in the area since before Marfa was properly a town. His father ran a smaller operation, now cattle, some horses, the specific ranching of a family that had adapted to the changing economics of the high desert without abandoning what the land meant to them. I want to describe him accurately and not in the way of someone who is trying to romanticize a type. He was tall, 6'2", lean in the way of someone whose body had been shaped by work rather than a gym. He wore Wranglers and work boots and a sun-faded chambray shirt and a hat that was a working hat rather than a decorative one. He had dark hair and darker eyes and the kind of tan that comes from living outdoors in West Texas, and that is entirely different from any other kind of tan. He spoke with the specific cadence of a West Texas accent that was different from the East Texas drawl most people associated with the state. Measured, direct, the sentences exactly as long as they needed to be. When I arrived at the monitoring station, he was already there. He looked at me. He said, "Julian Rivera." I said, "Yes." He said, "Cole Bennett, I am your local contact." He extended his hand. We shook hands. His hand was the hand of someone who worked with his hands. He said, "You look like you drove in yesterday." I said, "Sunday afternoon." He said, "How was it?" I said, "The sky is different." He held my gaze for a moment. He said, "Yes, it is." He said it with the specific quality of someone who had heard this observation many times from people arriving from elsewhere and who was not dismissing it. He said, "Come inside, I have coffee and I will walk you through the site geography." I came inside. He had coffee and he walked me through the site geography. And something in the walking through produced in me the specific quality of someone who is paying attention to information and also to the person delivering it and is not entirely sure which is the more compelling subject. I put this away immediately. He was my professional contact. I was here for 2 years. I was a city person in the wrong zip code. I put it away. Marfa was not what I expected. I am not sure what I had expected, something more uniform in its smallness, something more limited in its texture. What Marfa was? A small town with a specific character that had been shaped by its remoteness, and by the remarkable art scene that had developed there in the 1970s, when minimalist artist Donald Judd had moved to the area and had over time transformed several historic buildings into permanent art installations that drew visitors from around the world. The result was a community that was simultaneously a working West Texas ranching town and an international art destination. That had a diner serving biscuits and gravy and a gallery showing contemporary sculpture from artists who exhibited in New York and Berlin. That had Cole Bennett. And tourists from Tokyo. And the Marfa lights. In the sky. I found my rhythm in it more quickly than I expected. The work was good. Genuinely good in the way that field work is good, the specific satisfaction of taking measurements in the actual place rather than analyzing data in a building and the knowledge that the measurements mattered. Cole was the reason the field work was possible. He knew the land, he knew which ranches would allow monitoring equipment, he knew which roads were passable in September and which would become impassable in October. He knew the names of the families and their specific relationships to the industry and their specific concerns about what was happening to the air their children breathed. He translated the work for me in both directions, translating my technical framework into language the community could use, and translating the community's knowledge into information I could incorporate into the assessment. He was extraordinary at it. Not in the way of someone who had been trained for it, in the way of someone who simply understood both worlds from the inside. I said on the 3rd week driving back from a monitoring site on a ranch 20 miles north of town, "How did you end up doing this?" He drove the way he did everything with the specific competent ease of someone who had been doing this particular thing for a long time. His truck on the desert road, the landscape around us. He said, "My grandfather's land is near one of the expansion sites. When the company came to do the initial assessment, they did not speak to anyone who lived there, they did the assessment from the road." I said, "From the road?" He said, "Yes, without entering the property, without talking to the families, without understanding what the baseline actually was." I said, "And the results were?" He said, "Incomplete, and the community knew it, and nobody was listening." I said, "So you became the person who made listening possible." He drove. He said, I became the person who would not let them not listen. I held the window. I said, Cole. He said, yeah. I said, that is the most important kind of work. He drove. He looked at the road. He said, I know. He said, that is why I do it. October arrived in Marfa. The desert in October was not the desert of September. The days were shorter and the light changed and the cottonwood trees along the creek beds went gold in a way that was quietly extraordinary. I had been in Marfa for 6 weeks. I had spoken to Cole Bennett every working day and on several non-working days when the work required it. I had been to his family's ranch twice, once to survey a potential monitoring site, and once because his father had invited the new company man to Sunday dinner with the specific West Texas hospitality that assumed sharing a table was the natural response to proximity. His father, a quiet man named Robert Bennett, had made brisket and had asked me careful questions about the assessment work, and had listened to the answers with the same quality of attention his son had. I had begun to understand that the specific quality of listening I found so compelling in Cole was a family characteristic rather than a personal one. It ran in the land. In the way the land required you to pay attention or it would teach you the cost of not paying attention. And I had been thinking about Cole Bennett in the specific way that I had been told I should not be thinking about my professional contact. And I had been managing it with the specific discipline of someone who understood that the situation required management. And on the second Friday of October, he knocked on my door at the rental house on Lincoln Street. And he was holding his hat in his hands, and he said, I need to tell you something, and the management became significantly more difficult. He had never come to the rental house before. Our work was at the monitoring station or in his truck driving to sites or at his family's ranch. The rental house on Lincoln Street was my private space. He had known the address because the coalition had the address for practical reasons. He had never used it. The knock at 7 p.m. on a Friday in October was therefore different. I opened the door. He was standing on the porch. He had his hat in his hands. West Texas cowboys hold their hats when they are not on their heads the way people hold things they are not sure what to do with. The hat was in both hands, brim rotating slowly. The specific tell of someone managing something. He looked at me. He said, I need to tell you something. I held the door. I said, come in. He came in. He looked at the rental house interior the way he looked at things, taking it in without comment. I had made it more mine than it started, books on the shelves, the specific accumulated evidence of 6 weeks of living, a research map of the monitoring sites on the wall. He looked at the map. He said, you've added the Marquez Ranch. I said, they agreed to the monitoring equipment last week. He said, my father spoke to them. I said, I know, thank you. He held his hat. He said, Julian. I said, yeah. He said, I have been trying to figure out how to say something for about 3 weeks. I said, 3 weeks is a specific amount of time. He said, yes, it is the amount of time it has been obvious to me that I should say something and also that saying it might complicate a professional situation that is important to the work. I held the door I had not closed yet. I said, Cole. He said, yeah. I said, I am going to close the door and make coffee and you are going to tell me the thing. He said, okay. I closed the door. I made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. I sat across from him. He held the coffee cup. He said, I am gay. He said it with the specific directness of someone who has made a decision about how to say something and has said it exactly that way. I held my cup. He said, I am telling you because the alternative is not telling you, and not telling you has been making the past 3 weeks significantly more complicated than they need to be. I said, the 3 weeks. He said, yes, the 3 weeks since I understood that my interest in you was, he paused. I said, professional. He said, not exclusively. I held my cup. He said, I am not asking for anything, I am not making the work complicated. I am telling you because the not telling was already making it complicated and telling seemed better. I held my cup. I said, Cole. He said, yeah. I said, I am also gay. He held his cup. He looked at me. I said, I am also telling you because the alternative was not telling you, and I have been managing something for 6 weeks. He held his cup. He said, 6 weeks. I said, since the first Monday, since you said the sky is different, with the specific quality of someone who had thought about that before. He held his cup. He held it for a long time. He said, Julian. I said, yeah. He said, in Marfa. I said, yes. He said, being gay in Marfa is. I said, tell me. He held the cup. He said, my family knows, Robert knows, my grandmother before she passed knew, the people who matter know. He held the cup. The broader community, it is a small town, everyone has opinions about everyone, I do not hide it, I also do not. He stopped. I said, you do not make it the first thing. He said, yes. I said, because the first thing here is the land and the work and the family and the cattle. He said, yes. I said, and the gay thing is just the thing that is also true. He said, yes. I said, I understand that. He said, do you? I said, I am the son of Mexican immigrants in Chicago. I came out at 23. My parents received it with the specific combination of love and difficulty that is its own kind of complicated. The being gay thing is not the first thing for me either. The being Julian thing is the first thing. The gay thing is also true. He held the cup. He looked at me. He said, when you put it that way. I said, yes. He said, it sounds like someone who understands something specific about this. I said, I think I do. He held the cup. He said, Julian. I said, yeah. He said, the work is still the work. I said, yes. He said, and the professional situation is what it is. I said, yes. He said, and I told you because not telling was already the complication. I said, I know. He said, what do we do? I said, we drink the coffee and we figure out the rest. He held the cup. He said, the rest. I said, one thing at a time. He held the cup. He held it for a moment. He said, Julian. I said, yeah. He said, would you like to come to the ranch tomorrow? I said, for work. He said, no, not for work. I held my cup. I said, yes. He said, yes. I said, yes, I would like to come to the ranch tomorrow. He said, my father will make breakfast. I said, your father makes good food. He said, he does, the brisket is his. I said, I remember the brisket. He held his cup. The small smile came. Not the professional one, the actual one, the one that arrived when something was genuinely good. The Bennett Ranch was 12 miles east of Marfa. In the October morning light with the desert gold and the sky doing what the Marfa sky did, it was extraordinary in the way of things that are exactly what they are and do not apologize for it. The main house was a low adobe structure that had been added to over 3 generations. The first section his grandfather had built. The second section his father had added when he married. The third section, smallest, had been added when Cole came back from the 2 years he had spent at Texas A&M studying rangeland ecology. He had come back. I thought about this on the drive out. He had gone to college, he had studied something that gave him a framework for the land he had grown up on, and he had come back. Not as a failure, as someone who had chosen. I had never made a choice like that. Chicago had been home because it was home. I had not chosen it in the way of someone who had considered alternatives and returned. His father was on the porch when we arrived. Robert Bennett was 63. He had Cole's build and Cole's eyes and the specific weathered quality of 63 years of West Texas. He received me with the same quiet warmth as the Sunday dinner, no performance, no ceremony, just the specific West Texas hospitality of a man who had decided you were welcome. He made breakfast, eggs and bacon and biscuits and the coffee that Cole had clearly learned from him, strong and honest and exactly what the morning required. We ate at the kitchen table. Robert said, the air quality work, how long before you have results? I said, the baseline assessment takes about 18 months, then 6 months of analysis. The final report goes to the coalition and to the regulatory agencies. He said, and the results, will they tell us what we already know? I said, what do you already know? He said, that when the wind comes from the east and the activity at the basin is high, my cattle move away from the eastern pasture. I held my coffee. I said, cattle are excellent air quality sensors, they move away from things that affect their respiratory systems. He said, I know. I said, the results will quantify what you already know, put numbers on it, give the coalition something to bring to the regulatory process. He said, numbers matter to the regulators. I said, yes, I wish they were not the only thing that mattered, but yes. He held his coffee. He looked at Cole. Something passed between them. He said, Cole said you understood the work. I said, I try too. He said, it is more than trying. He said it simply, not as a compliment exactly, as an assessment. After breakfast, Cole took me out to see the land. Not the monitoring site version, the actual land, the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. We walked. Not quickly, at the pace of someone who wanted me to see rather than to cover ground. He said, my grandfather homesteaded here in 1951, he came from New Mexico, he had been a sheepherder in his youth. I said, from sheepherder to cattle rancher. He said cattle were more honest. I said, what did he mean? Cole said, sheep follow, cattle decide. He said he preferred to work with animals that had opinions. I looked at the land around us. I said, do you? He said, prefer animals with opinions. I said, yes. He said, yes, always. The cattle tell you things about the land if you pay attention, where the water is, where the grass is better, where the air is wrong. I said, the eastern pasture. He said, yes. We walked. The desert around us. The specific quality of high Chihuahuan desert in October, the grass is gold, the yucca still green, the distant mountains blue against the enormous sky. He said, Julian. I said, yeah. He said, what do you see when you look at this? I said, the sky is different. He looked at me. He said, still. I said, it will always be different. I did not grow up under this sky, it will always be other than what I expected. He said, is that bad? I held the landscape. I said, no, I have decided it is not bad. The different is the thing I came here for, even though I did not know that was what I came for. He walked. He said, I have never left. I said, I know. He said, people assume that means I did not want to. I said, did you? He said, I wanted to understand what this was before I left it. I went to college, I learned the science of the land I had always known by instinct, and then I understood it, and then I came back. I said, you chose it. He said, every day. I held the landscape. I said, Cole. He said, yeah. I said, I have been a city person my whole life, I did not choose it, it was simply where I was. He said, and now? I held the landscape. The sky. The gold October desert. The specific quality of a place that was exactly what it was. I said, I am beginning to understand what choosing means. He looked at me. The October morning light on his face. He said, Julian Rivera. I said, yeah. He said, come on, I'll show you the east pasture. I said, the one the cattle avoid. He said, the one the cattle avoid. I said, yes, let's go. November, December. The work progressed. The monitoring stations were established. The data was being collected. The coalition was pleased with the pace and the quality. My supervisor in Chicago called with the specific pleased but slightly surprised tone of someone who had expected the remote assignment to produce difficulties and was finding instead that it was producing excellent results. The results were excellent partly because Cole Bennett made them possible. And Cole Bennett had become, through October and November and the beginning of December, the specific person that someone becomes when the professional relationship and the other relationship are existing simultaneously in a context small enough that they inform each other. The work was better because I understood the land more. I understood the land more because Cole had shown it to me. He had shown me the east pasture and the cattle that avoided it and the specific quality of the air on the days when the basin activity was high and the wind came from the east. He had shown me the Marfa lights on a clear November night, driving out to the viewing area east of town and standing in the dark desert air while the specific unexplained lights moved in the darkness to the south. He had shown me his grandmother's house preserved by his father as she had left it, and the photographs of the family across 3 generations of West Texas. He had shown me how to build a fire correctly, which I had not known how to do, and which he taught with the same quality of patient directness he brought to everything. And I had been showing him things too. The air quality data and what it meant. The The specific science of why the cattle moved away from the eastern pasture in precise and measurable terms that gave the intuitive knowledge a language the regulators would have to acknowledge. And other things. The Chicago things, my family. My parents who had come from Oaxaca and who had built a life in Chicago through the specific determined work of people who had decided their children would have options they themselves had not had. My father, who made mole from a recipe his grandmother had given his mother who had given it to him, and who had received my coming out with the specific combination of love and difficulty that Mexican Catholic families sometimes produced, and who had, over 4 years, arrived at a place of complete acceptance. He said on the evening I told him about my father's journey, "That took courage from both of you." I said, "Which both?" He said, "You for telling him for doing the work of arriving somewhere different from where he started." I held my coffee. I said, "Cole." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Your family." He said, "Yes." I said, "Robert has always known." He said, "He knew before I told him at 19, he said, 'I know, son, and are you okay and good, now help me with the fence line.'" I said, "Help me with the fence line." He said, "That is Robert's version of 'I love you and everything is fine.'" I said, "I think I need to steal that for my father." He almost smiled. "The actual one." He said, "Julian." I said, "Yeah." He said, "December is quiet here." I said, "I know, I have started to like the quiet." He said, "The city person is becoming something else." I said, "Something else is possible." He said, "Yes." He said, "I have something to ask you." I said, "Ask." He held his coffee. He said, "Christmas on the ranch. My father, my aunt from Alpine, my cousin and her family. My grandmother's tradition was that everyone came to the ranch." I said, "Yes." He said, "Would you come?" I said, "To Christmas on the ranch?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Cole Bennett?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "I would like that very much." He said, "Good." He said, "My father will make brisket." I said, "I know." He said, "And my aunt makes tamales." I said, "Tamales." He said, "Yes, my grandmother taught her. My grandmother was from Presidio, Mexican-American family. The tamales are from her recipe." I held my coffee. I said, "The Chihuahuan Desert." He said, "Yes." I said, "Where the land runs on both sides of the border." He said, "Yes." I said, "My family is from Oaxaca." He said, "I know." I said, "Your grandmother's tamales are from Presidio, which is from a tradition that my grandmother's tamales are also from." He said, "Different recipes." I said, "Same roots." He held his coffee. He said, "Same roots." I said, "Cole." He said, "Yeah." I said, "I love you." I said it the way I said things when I had decided to say them, without preamble, without the performance of building to it, the direct version. He held his coffee. He held it for a long moment. He said, "Julian." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I have been in love with you since the second week. When you got out of the truck at the Martinez Ranch and you looked at the land way the land deserves to be looked at." I said, "The way it deserves to be looked at." He said, "Like it is real and specific and matters, not like it is scenery." I said, "It does matter." He said, "I know not everyone sees that." I said, "Cole." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I love you too." He said it with the specific directness he brought to everything that was true. Christmas on the Bennett Ranch was the tamales from his grandmother's recipe, and his father's brisket, and the aunt from Alpine who talked with the specific energy of someone who saved up conversation for family occasions, and was releasing it all at once, and his cousin Lucia and her husband and their 3 children who ran through the house with the specific chaotic joy of children at Christmas. And Robert Bennett, who sat at the head of the table and watched his son with the expression of a father who has been waiting for a specific kind of good to arrive in his child's life and has seen it arrive. In the desert at night after dinner, the specific December Marfa sky, the stars that were different from any stars I had seen in Chicago because there was nothing here to compete with them. And Cole beside me on the porch looking at the stars with the ease of someone who had been looking at this sky his whole life, and for whom the stars were simply the ordinary beautiful ceiling of the world he inhabited. And I thought, I have been here for 4 months, and the transfer was for 2 years. And 2 years felt, for the first time since I had arrived in Marfa, like not enough time. Like the thing I had come for was larger than the thing I had been told I was coming for. And Cole looked at the stars and then he looked at me and he said, "What are you thinking?" And I said, "I am thinking about what comes after 2 years." And he looked back at the stars, and he did not say anything for a while, and then he said, "That is a good thing to be thinking about." The new year arrived in Marfa the way everything arrived in Marfa, without announcement or ceremony. The sky was simply different at midnight in the way it was always simply different. We watched it from the porch of the rental house on Lincoln Street. His hat on the railing beside him. The desert cold at 12,000 feet above sea level in January, not Chicago cold, the different cold of altitude and dry air. The specific silence of a small town at midnight that was different from the absence of sound silence and was instead the presence of a very large quiet. He said, "What do you want the year to be?" I said, "That is a large question." He said, "Yes." I said, "The assessment runs through September, the analysis through March of next year." He said, "That is the work version of the answer." I said, "Yes." He said, "I asked about the year." I held the cold. I said, "I want the year to be what the last 4 months have been, but more." He said, "More." I said, "More of the land and the work and the ranch, more of the tamales and the brisket and Robert's specific version of I love you." He said, "Help me with the fence line." I said, "Yes, more of that." He said, "And?" I said, "More of you." He held the railing. He said, "Julian." I said, "Yeah." He said, "2 years ends in September." I said, "Yes." He said, "And then?" I held the cold. I said, "That is the question I have been sitting with." He said, "And?" I said, "I have been looking at the possibility of extending the assignment. The coalition wants the long-term monitoring to continue. My company would support an extension if I requested it." He held the railing. He said, "Would that be for the work?" I said, "Partly." He said, "And the other part?" I said, "The other part is you, and the ranch and the sky and the tamales." He said, "And Marfa?" I said, "In Marfa." He held the railing. He said, "Julian." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Choosing a place is different from being somewhere because you are assigned to it." I said, "I know." He said, "I want to make sure you understand the difference." I said, "Tell me." He said, "When I came back from college I chose this place. Every year since then I have chosen it again. The choosing is not something that happens once, it is something that happens again and again. When the work is hard and the market is difficult and the drought comes, you choose it again." I said, "And if I stay?" He said, "If you stay you will be choosing Marfa. Every year, when it is remote and isolated and far from your family and the things you grew up knowing." I said, "Yes." He said, "And I want you to understand that I am not asking you to choose it for me, I am asking you to choose it because it is the right thing for you." I held the railing. I held it for a long moment. I said, "Cole Bennett." He said, "Yeah." I said, "I have been a city person my whole life, not because I chose it, because it was there." He said, "Yes." I said, "And I have been here for 4 months. And in 4 months I have learned more about what I actually want than in 27 years of being exactly where I was expected to be." He said, "What do you actually want?" I said, "Work that matters in a place that matters and a person who understands what both of those things mean." He said, "That is specific." I said, "Yes." He said, "And Marfa has all three?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Julian?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "The choosing is yours, I want to be clear about that." I said, "I know." I said, "And I am choosing." He said, "Yes." I said, "Yes, the assignment extension, the long-term monitoring, the ranch and the brisket and the sky and the fence line I do not yet know how to build properly." He said, "I will teach you the fence line." I said, "I know." He said, "It takes time to learn." I said, "I have time." He said, "Yes." He said, "Julian?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I am glad you drove into Marfa on a Sunday in September." I said, "So am I." He said, "And I am glad you looked at the sky." I said, "It was impossible not to look at the sky." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is how it gets you." The spring. March. The Chihuahuan Desert in spring was a different country from the Chihuahuan Desert in September when I had arrived. The winter rains had been good. The desert bloomed, not dramatically, not in the way of places that put on a show. In the specific quiet way of a desert that does not announce its beauty but simply produces it for the people who are paying attention. The monitoring data was telling us what Robert's cattle had already known. The air quality in the eastern pasture and the surrounding area on high-activity days was measurably different from the baseline. The specific compounds associated with oil and gas extraction were present at levels that required regulatory attention. Cole had brought the preliminary data to a community meeting in February. He had stood at the front of the Marfa Lights Festival Hall, a repurposed historic building that served as the community's meeting space, and he had presented the data in plain language that translated the technical framework into something every rancher and farmer in the room could understand. He had said, "What your cattle are telling you is true, we have the numbers now." The room had been quiet for a moment. And then Robert Bennett from the third row had said, "What do we do with the numbers?" And Cole had said, "We take them to Austin, and we take them to Washington, and we do not stop until the numbers become policy." The room had responded. Not with applause exactly, with the specific West Texas response to something that needed doing, the quiet nod of people who had decided to do the thing. I had stood at the side of the room and I had watched him. And I had thought, this is what choosing looks like, this specific person in this specific room doing the specific work he was built for. Afterward we drove back to the ranch. Robert made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. Robert said, "Good work." He said it to both of us. I said the data was there, Cole made it accessible. Robert said the data without Cole is just numbers, Cole without the data is just frustration. He looked between us. He said, "Together it is something that can move." I held my coffee. I said, "Yes." Robert held his coffee. He said, "Julian." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Are you staying?" It was not a question that required elaboration. The specific directness of a man who had been living with questions and had decided to ask one. I said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He said, "Help me with the fence line before the season starts." I looked at Cole. Cole held his coffee. He was looking at the table. He was not looking at his father. Because his face was doing the thing it did when something was exactly right, the visible quality of someone receiving a good thing. I said, "Yes, sir, I would like to learn the fence line." Yeah. Robert said, "Cole will teach you." Cole said, "I will." Robert stood. He took his coffee to the window. He looked out at the desert. He said quietly, mostly to himself, "Good spring this year." He said, "The grass is coming back." The April evening, the desert doing what it did in spring, the Bennett kitchen, the three of us. And the fence line to learn. July. The assignment extension had been approved in April. The company had been pleased, the coalition had been pleased. My supervisor had made the specific sound of someone who had expected a more complicated conversation and had not gotten it. I had called my parents. My mother had been the one to ask, "And you are happy there?" I had said, "Yes, more than I expected." She had said, "That is the best kind of happy, the unexpected kind." I had said, "Mama, I am seeing someone." She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Tell me." I had told her, not everything at once, the shape of it, the ranch and the work and the family and the way the sky was different and the tamales from his grandmother's recipe that came from the same tradition as our family's tamales because the Chihuahuan Desert ran on both sides of the border and the food carried the history of the land. She had been quiet for a longer moment after that. She had said, "He sounds like someone your grandfather would have liked." I had said, "Why?" She had said, "Your grandfather always said, find someone who knows the land they stand on. Those people are reliable." I had said, "Mama." She had said, "Yes." I had said, "I love you." She had said, "I know, when are you bringing him to Chicago?" I had said, "When the summer is over." She had said, "Good, I will make mole." Cole and I had driven to Chicago in August. 3 days, his truck, the long road from Marfa through the Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma and Missouri and into Illinois. He saw Chicago the way I had seen Marfa. He looked at the lake. He stood at the edge of Lake Michigan on the first morning and he looked at the water and he said, "It is enormous." I said, "Yes." He said, it looks like the sky. I said, that is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about Lake Michigan. He met my parents. My father's version of the Bennett welcome was different, more noise, more food, more ceremony. My mother's table set with the specific abundance of a Mexican-American family that expressed love through the size of what was offered. She made mole. Cole ate 3 helpings. My mother watched him eat with the specific expression that Claudette Coleman had used watching me eat at Christmas. My father sat beside Cole and asked him about the ranch and the cattle and the land, and Cole answered with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. At some point my father said in Spanish, "This one is good." He said it quietly, he did not know Cole spoke Spanish. Cole said also in Spanish, "Thank you, Señor Rivera." My father looked at him. He said, "You speak Spanish." Cole said, "My grandmother was from Presidio, the border is close, the language runs in the land." My father looked at him for a long moment. He said, "Help me in the kitchen." Which was, I understood immediately and with a warmth I had not expected to feel so suddenly, my father's version of help me with the fence line. "I love you, everything is fine, come with me." I sat at the table. My mother sat beside me. She held my hand. She said, "He fits." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not like the city, like something that grows here." I said, "That is the best way to describe it." She said, "Julian." I said, "Yes, Mama." She said, "You have chosen well." I said, "Yes, I think I have." She said, "The unexpected kind." I said, "The best kind." 1 year from the Sunday, I had driven into Marfa. The assessment was complete, the data was robust, the coalition had the numbers, the regulatory process was beginning. Cole had driven to Austin twice already with the preliminary findings. He would drive there again in the fall. I would be at the monitoring station, building the long-term data set, choosing the work, choosing the place, choosing again every day. On the Sunday of the anniversary, we drove out to the desert at sunset. Not to a monitoring site, just out. His truck on the desert road. The sunset over the Chinati Mountains to the southwest, which in September turned the mountains pink and orange in a way that was specific to West Texas and that I had not understood in September of the previous year and that I understood now. We got out of the truck. We stood on the road. The sunset. The enormous sky. He held my hand. I said, 1 year. He said, yes. I said, I was certain about a lot of things a year ago. He said, what were you certain of? I said, cities, the kind of person I was going to love, the shape of my life. He said, and now? I said, now I am certain about different things. He said, tell me. I said, the sky is different, and the difference is the thing I needed. He said, and? I said, and you, I am certain about you. He held my hand. The sunset. The Chinati Mountains going pink. He said, Julian Rivera. I said, yeah. He said, I am glad you were wrong about what you were certain of. I said, so am I. He said, the city person. I said, is becoming something else. He said, something that knows the land it stands on. I said, yes. He said, reliable. I said, your grandfather's criterion. He said, and your grandfather's. I held his hand. The desert. The sunset. The specific quality of a sky that had been different from the first day and had become, over 1 year of looking at it, the sky I knew. Cole, I said. Yeah. I am choosing this, I said. Yes, he said. Every day, I said. Every day, he said. The land and the work and the ranch and the fence line I am still learning, and the cattle that tell you the truth about the air and the tamales from your grandmother's recipe, and the sky that is different from any sky I grew up under. He said, and me. I said, and you, most of all you. He held my hand. He looked at the sunset. He said, Julian. I said, yeah. He said, the cattle have moved back to the eastern pasture. I said, I know, the regulatory notice produced a temporary reduction in activity. He said, they know. I said, yes, they know. He said, pay attention to what the land tells you. I said, I am learning. He said, yes. He said, you are. The sunset going deeper. The desert. The sky. The specific quality of a place that was exactly what it was and nothing else. And me, 1 year from the Sunday I had arrived certain of everything. Certain now of the one thing I had not been able to plan. His hand in mine. The choosing. Every day. The rest of it.